Hi, my name is Steve Hayes, and this is another dialogue in the series of dialogues around the book on a reintegration of behavioral science and evolution science that myself and my colleague David Sloan Wilson have organized. This particular team is focusing on the issue of emotion and empathy, with a team on sort of each side of that conversation. So I'm just start out, since there's quite a number here, and I want to make sure that we get all the names and affiliations right. If we could just go on at a time and introduce yourself with your name and affiliation, and then we'll launch into our discussion. So in no particular order, anyone want to step forward, just introduce yourself?
Sure, I'll go first. This is Zach Rosenthal. I am an associate professor at Duke University Medical Center and Duke University.
And I'm Kibby. I'm Kibby McMahon. I'm a graduate student here at Duke, and I'm working with Zach.
And I'm Lynn O'Connor, and I'm a professor at the Wright Institute, and I'm a clinician and do research.
And I'm Jack Berry. I'm an associate professor with the psychology department at Samford University in Birmingham. So it's Sam, not Stan, as some of our t-shirts say.
Okay. And so what I would like to do is just to ask each team to just put in, about a 5-minute description of what they had to say in their chapter. And why don't we start with the evolution science team? So Lynn and Jack, if you can just get us oriented towards what you wrote about. Of course, in the book form, people will be able to read it, but get those who are watching this on YouTube or whatever a little orientation.
We're actually going to read our abstract because it's the most concise statement. And Jack, jump in when you have something to add here. Okay. In this chapter, we discuss the evolution of mammalian emotions, the universal socially focused mechanisms that allow us to adapt together to changes in our environment based upon the situation or context in which they appear. Our species may be unique among mammals in the way in which it's been able to spread out and live successfully in every corner of the planet, carrying with us the same hardwired emotional capacities everywhere. Despite the wide range of situations in which we've settled, despite the fact that emotions everywhere serve the same social functions, nevertheless, context-based differences in the experience and expression of emotions have evolved. We discuss the local, physical, cultural, and social context in which variations in emotions may occur. Using an evolutionary perspective, we explain the emergence of individualism and collectivism, during which culture and genes evolve together, impacting emotional tendencies. We then discuss how culture-gene co-evolutionary processes is affecting changes in the male emotionality in contemporary culture. As an aside, we focus in on the evolution of altruism, empathy, compassion, and survivor guilt. Here we illustrate how pro-social emotion, related behavior, altruism, may involve punishment as a function of group selection, further illustrating how the level of selection itself serves as an influential context. We discuss survivor guilt and how it plays out differently depending on the level of selection in which it's being considered. Finally, we turn to the role of psychotherapy itself, the unique social context in which people are able to gain skill in regulating their emotions, experiencing firsthand their capacity for change. We were amazed, by the way, how many things that we touched on that you all touched on.
Anything you want to add, Jack, to that description?
I don't think so. I contributed to the abstract quite a bit. You cut it from the paper. It turns out that you didn't want abstracts, but yeah, I think it covers things pretty well.
We thought it was the most concise statement we could make.
And I do want to say, before I turn it over to the next team, that people should know that there was basically little guidance from the editors about exactly how to approach this. So the overlap and similarity was not structured by us. It was simply allowing, and the same thing with the differences. And we thought that would be a best way to get into a dialogue. So if we could turn over to Kibby and Zach, you want to do a brief summary of what you wrote about in your essay?
Sure. I agree with Lynn, actually. We found a lot of commonality. I was reading your essay and I loved seeing the similar themes of how important emotions and empathy are to us as a social being. So how it functions in our survival as humans. But in our chapter, we explored a little bit more about understanding empathy and emotions through the perspective of contextualism, the philosophy of science. So that means that we try to understand empathy as fundamentally dependent on the context or social situation or environment in which it arises. And so we discussed how that would be potentially useful, especially for the science and practice of psychology. We discussed at first the previous research of empathy and the perception of emotions. We focused on the perception of emotions in this paper. And how past research has focused on the universality of emotions. So how certain emotions, experiences, and expressions are common across context and cultures. For example, Paul Ekman's work is the thing that comes to mind the most when I think about the universality of empathy. And so we discussed that literature and thought about how there's a lot of limitations with that approach. It often disregards or pushes aside the huge variability in how emotions are expressed and even perceived. And so we wanted to focus on that part about how what that variability means and how emotions can be universal, but at the same time can be very differently expressed and perceived across cultures, across time, across different social situations. So because that variability hasn't really been addressed as much and emphasized in the literature, we talked about how contextualism could really be an approach that brings that focus to the context, to understand empathy and emotions as behaviors in context and what works in context. So what we mean by that is how an empathic response or emotion contributes to fulfilling a goal, an interpersonal goal in a certain situation. So we discussed a little bit about how that would be a paradigm shift for how empathy is understood and studied up till now. And it really goes along with some trends in emotion and empathy science where there's a lot of evidence showing that empathy is really context dependent. There's some situations where reading an emotion is very useful and sometimes it's not. So we talked about the implications of viewing empathy through contextualism and the implications for both science and psychotherapy. So that's a little spiel about our chapter.
And Zach, you want to add anything to that?
I think that's a pretty good overview Kibbe just gave. I mean, the general framework we were coming from in thinking about this chapter was, essentially as it relates to emotion. What if we thought about empathy from a contextualistic perspective rather than from a universal perspective? And sort of all things stem in the chapter, at least from that basic distinction.
Well, both of the teams have dealt with issues of specificity and universality, and we're going to get there pretty soon, I imagine. But before we do, maybe we could even take a moment to talk about what we mean by emotion. We may not be able to get full agreement because as you take one versus another philosophical approach, we actually can change the essence of what the topic is. But just to get on the same page, and for people who are just watching this, what do we even mean by emotion, and why has it been so hard in the field to answer that question? I think to this day, if you take a bunch of emotion scientists, put them in the room and say, quick, define it, you'd get quite a wide range of definitions. So what are we talking about? And then let's move on to these issues of universality and why it may be important.
I'll jump in first on this. I think it's a great point, Steve, and I think you're exactly right. And we see this at conferences when people talk about this topic. To my thinking, part of why this is such a challenge to define from a consensus perspective is that I think emotions. I think the way we talk about emotions, the way we think about, the way we talk, the way we communicate about emotions really intersects with some of the most fundamental aspects of human experience. And because of that, because it's really at that kind of nexus point of so many things fundamental to being human, it attracts many different definitions and many different viewpoints and operationalizations, right? Emotion touches learning, it touches memory, it touches thinking, it touches arousal and attention and sensation and perception. All of our basic processes, we know at some level intersect with what we call emotion. And then of course there's the fundamentals, right? Survival, reproduction, mating, trust, intimacy. And then there's sort of other fundamentals of, at least as I think about it, of human experience, which, you know, are less directly related perhaps to evolution or survival, but are fundamentally human, which are things like imagination, inspiration, right? These sort of experiences we have that make us human, that are very much, all of which I would say are really caused by, consequences of, or co-occur with what we call emotions. And so for all of that, all of those reasons, I think it's just it's such an important ill-defined construct, because there's so many people who have a vested interest in wanting to understand what it is for very different purposes.
Yeah,
go ahead, Jack.
Okay. Yeah, I also wanted to emphasize it's true that it's difficult to define because it's so complex, but I believe also that there are just a lot of philosophical and theoretical assumptions by different people who are proposing definitions, and I think that greatly constrains how people define emotion. And if you've got widely different philosophical perspectives, it's going to create a breakdown in consensus. I mean, just for an example, a methodological behaviorist I assume is not going to include feelings in any definition of emotion. And you contrast that with William James. I just read his What is an Emotion recently. Feelings are essential to his definition. Basically emotions are the feelings of bodily changes in response to stimuli. So conscious experience is the key. I don't know what he would make of the idea of unconscious emotions. Lynn and I talk a lot about unconscious emotions, and that's partly based on our philosophical and theoretical perspective. So this doesn't have to do with the kind of Freudian topographic theory of the mind sort of thing, but it's a commitment to an evolutionary perspective where what is ultimately important in evolution is that some kind of behavior has to make a difference to fitness. And there is research showing that there are very rapid physiological changes and behavioral responses that occur before feelings are felt, before you evaluate the situation. But when you respond quickly like that, this can get you out of trouble, or your child out of trouble. And so even though consciousness isn't involved, it's quite functional. So because of that, we're willing to include in any definition of emotion unconscious processes as well. And others may simply not acknowledge that. I don't know the perspective of the contextual behavior scientists on issues of unconscious processes. So maybe later we could discuss that. I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, can I add to that? I like that the intersection between our chapter and yours. The idea of the survivalist function. I mean, the goal is the fitness, as you said, the fitness of the species. And when you think of a contextualist definition of emotion, would say whatever responses that fulfill a certain goal, like to help us survive. And what's tricky about emotions is that this is such a collection of different processes. There's a behavioral, there's the subjective experience, a communication, physiological. There's so many different aspects that emotion scientists tend to focus on one and say, it's the physiological response, that's what the emotion is. But we view it as a collection of these things. And we like to think about it as, I guess, states of being that motivates humans or other organisms in their environment in a way that fulfills a goal, in which case the bigger goal of survival. So that's a very broad definition of emotion, but that's kind of how we tend to think about it.
Well, so you raised the issues of assumptions, and Jack, you even mentioned James. I think people should know one reason we titled the book as a reintegration is that you can really track the more contextualistic wing of behavioral science back to James. And James, definitely you can link very tightly to Darwin and trying to deal with the implications of Darwin and the behavioral sciences. So reintegration seemed to be a good way of talking about how to bring these two wings back together. But there are differences in your chapters having to do with assumptions, and they penetrate all the way down to, well, to strategy for sure, but maybe even how we think about emotion. And would it be worth talking this a little bit? Jack, you're raising at the end there about, what behavioral science folks might think about things that are not verbally accessible, et cetera.
Yeah. I mean,
what about these
when
issues?
we define emotions, we're probably on the surface. I think we're going to look very similar. We're touching all the same bases. So, and I think some of the differences would arise when we get down to the details of the meaning of a lot of our terms. We are. Oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Go ahead. Well, I wanted to jump in, and what all of you were saying is that, Jack and I think of emotions as a package, and that covers biology. We do include feelings, obviously cognitions, everything is sort of merged together, and you can't really separate the components. It really is a package. And we do think of emotions as relevant in all mammalian behavior. So that may be our evolutionary perspective. But I also think about it as a clinician, though. Jack, go on.
Yeah, like I was saying that, a lot of overlap. I think we both emphasize that emotions actually do tend to serve, interpersonal functions. I mean, these mechanisms evolved in part for group living. So this is why, we share our emotions, we express them, not always through the face. There are various ways of getting the information across. This is why, empathy is important. So emotions evolved, for group living. So they're all, at some level, there's going to be this, interpersonal function. I have mentioned that we're willing to discuss, unconscious emotions. That is an assumption. We have to admit we're mentalists. We do kind of follow the computer metaphor in our thinking. So.
And we think of emotions. We think of empathy as really being able to understand what someone else is feeling. It doesn't necessarily mean that the emotion is shared. In Levinson's research, they found that couples actually didn't do so well when they actually shared an emotion, when their empathy was like they were feeling exactly the same thing. And then Namdi Pol, doing for his dissertation, studied psychotherapy cases, 3 cases, I think, and they found the same thing. And when the therapist and the patient were feeling exactly the same, emotion wasn't necessarily so good. So we make a distinction between, being accurate about being able to read somebody's emotion and sharing emotion.
Yeah, I think what you're also raising an interesting point of what part of emotions or what part of empathy is conscious. I think it's really interesting, a whole field of cognitive science talking about the differences between cognitive processes that are conscious versus unconscious, when you're actually aware of what's going on or not. And sharing emotion, you could share an emotion and be consciously aware of it or not. You could also feel an emotion and be consciously aware of it or not. I still think that it is considered information and processes that are going on in your mind or body or whatever. But the idea of like where that light is shining, the consciousness is illuminating, can be different. And it's not necessarily an emotion has to be conscious or unconscious, but it's about what we're able to understand and be aware of.
We think that most of the time we're not aware of our emotions. Like if you think of how you go through the day, you have emotions a zillion times that you don't really you have to stop and actually deliberately focus on it to be able to think, what is it I was feeling? So I think we think of emotions as probably most often unconscious.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's an interesting point of taking the dual systems approach and understand that there's a conscious mind and the unconscious mind, and so much of what we perceive and understand and think about can be part of that unconscious part. What's interesting about that is that people tend to call that unconscious part the automatic system, where when things are unconscious, you tend to act on it automatically. You make decisions, you behave, you react without conscious awareness or intentionality. And sometimes when we have to become aware of it, that leaves it open for us to start to act with more intention, with more executive function and planning, versus when you feel an emotion and not aware of it, you may tend to act on it automatically based on learning history or habits or associated patterns. I think it's an interesting point.
Conscious or unconscious, we kind of think of emotions. I guess we're back to the definition of emotions. We think of emotions as this package, this entity that basically drives behavior. Like we can know cognitively that we should do X, Y, or Z, but we don't have the sort of the energy engine from emotions. We very well may not do it.
Mm. Yeah, the other thing I would add to this that we haven't said yet is that when we think about the package metaphor for emotions, and you think about the different systems that are involved in that package, there is one level of analysis to think about, which of course is relevant, which is the sort of the neural and the nervous system level of analysis. And one of the things I think that can be problematic that a lot of us who are researchers and certainly clinicians and lay people do is we think sometimes make the mistake of coupling together the terms, the affective state, feeling state terms, right? The feelings of this or that. We sometimes ascribe those feeling state subjective terms, particular kind of underlying brain system kind of centers of circuitry or locus of existence. When I think what we know reasonably well at this point is to your point earlier that the systems in our brain that are designed to non-consciously detect threat, to manage the unending stream of or then rally our motivational systems to respond, those are dissociable, related but separate systems to those systems we have in our brain and that are really about labeling emotions as words and making sense consciously of them. So I think it's important to keep kind of this perspective in mind that the words we use matter, right? The words we use to talk about emotions matter. How we talk about emotions matter. And if we are consistently conflating systems in our brain that are conscious versus non-conscious, that could have pretty important implications for the science that emerges and perhaps applied intervention approaches that emerge from that.
I'm curious. Jack and I had a conversation about this and didn't come to a conclusion. Why do you think that words really matter? Besides our president's words. Why do you think words?
Why do we think words matter?
Yeah. In terms of,
I think it's, yeah, I'm sorry, my internet connection is a little goes in and out. I think it's an interesting point that you raised in your paper talking about the experience versus communication of an emotion, where you said that experience is universal, but the communication is very different, like the way we display rules and how we communicate emotions. And so Zach and I were talking about where is the line drawn between experience and communication. I only know how you're feeling if you tell me what you're feeling. There's no way to tell if you tell me I'm sad. If I tell you I'm sad and you tell me you're sad, we think that we're feeling the same thing, but maybe our experiences could be completely different.
We can't really feel each other's emotions. I don't think that's true. I think we really do feel each other's emotions. Non-consciously, we're not aware of it. We're reading people's emotions, not just from, expressions. The face is just one thing, but body, we smell each other's emotions. The t-shirt studies that we can smell our immune system proteins. It's amazing what we pick up on. We see each other's pupil size, and when pupil size is bigger, then we know somebody's interested. So I think we may not share the emotions exactly, but we read each other's emotions pretty damn accurately most of the time, I think, without words.
Yeah, no, I think, let me try to synthesize. I think we do. Empathy exists, right? We are able to discern other people's affective experience, their cognitive experience to an extent, right? In different contexts. I don't think that's really at the heart of what I think Kibbe was trying to say. I think what she's trying to say is something more to the effect of the way in which we communicate with our words does impact how our emotions are interpreted or received and responded to by others, that words do matter. Not that words alone are the only thing that matters, but that words also matter.
If we do a deep dive into this issue of words, it would be probably take us in a different direction, because of course we have a whole another thing having to do with cognition, and we actually have a team that's looking at that. But I'm a little surprised, Lynn, to hear you ask the question as if they might not, just in this sense. I mean, the way you've defined emotion would go back to, any complex organism that has a capacity for learning, and that's 500 million years old. I mean, that's from the Cambrian forward. If you want to include habituation only, well, then it goes before that. But what you and I are doing right now is arguably has some special features. I think most people would recognize that human language and cognition does exactly what it is. And the reason I'm surprised is you're a therapist. I mean, aren't you doing in the work you're doing mostly talking to people? And if you really didn't think that words mattered, and yet you thought emotion was central, as you just said, how would you end up doing psychotherapy out of that perspective?
Well, sometimes, like when I think of the words I use and say an interpretation, that's really an explanation of something. So sometimes the words are really important, and that somebody might get some insight out of an interpretation that's new for them. But so much of it's like treatment by attitude. So much of what happens in therapy that I do is implicit learning. And so much of, words are really important for explicit learning, but treatment by attitude is really, really central. So I'm not saying words never matter, but I'm saying they may not be the most important thing in a treatment.
So you're talking about something that's kind of top down, but of course, even if you're going to get somebody to get into these more implicit things, you're going to have to guide them very likely verbally. I doubt if you just dance with your clients, you probably ask them to orient towards issues or to.
Right. Yeah, I get you.
But so that sense of, and if we come back then to this issue about, why emotions are so important. What do you think if you just take your particular perspectives and now begin to look at it, just begin to sort of look at this issue of the so what part of the kind of work we do in therapy or, the things when we're working with humans. From the perspective you just laid out, why does it matter? Why are emotions so important?
I mean, I think of, sorry, go ahead.
Just they drive behavior. I mean, if they really are the energy engine behind everything we do. That's why.
I agree. I think they definitely drive behavior, and we could even see in animals and other, non-human primates that other beings have an emotion, fear, for example, and that ensures survival in a lot of cases. And I think it's so important because there's so much history of academic work or scholarly work trying to understand these emotions that have persisted along the human race, and even in animals too. They're so important, and we relate to the emotions in other people similarly. So we feel that is very central to our survival and to our experience as humans. And yet they're elusive, yet they can vary so much from person to person and culture to culture and context to context. That is such an interesting question of what is emotion and why is it so important and why does it drive all the decisions and actions that I make during the day. I don't know about you guys, but for me it does. So.
Yeah, emotions, as we're talking about them in this context, emotions and the understanding of emotions, not only are they, and I agree with you, Lynn, not only are they really the engine that drives behavior, but more to, I think, sort of perhaps the specific point here of this is that they drive our social connectedness, because my emotional expression is understood or not understood well by any of you, or perhaps by anybody who's listening, right? And so am I feeling understood is a function of how well someone is, empathically attuned, if you will, sort of aware and able to classify the emotion I'm experiencing in a way that's consistent enough with what I believe I'm experiencing, but also able to help me make sense of my own motivational tendencies. The clearer I am with my motivational needs, my behavioral response needs in context, the clearer I am, the more efficient I can be, right? And the more efficient I can be, the better. And if we pivot that idea over to social functioning, the more efficient I can be in attaining pro-social goals in context, the better, right? As a function of somebody else understanding my emotions. Now, not to mention, even just backing up, I think we could even back up from all of that and say, when I'm emotionally attuned, empathic, aware, able to make sense of, etc., somebody else, one thing we know is that does have an impact on their nervous system arousal, right? It can decrease their autonomic arousal system in a way that then might open up their attentional systems, might open them up to be able to be more effective, to be more likely to learn, to be more open to new experiences. So simply just understanding others' emotional expression can then have this cascade of effects, whether that's in psychotherapy, whether that's me at home with my wife or my kids, or whether that's really in any social context.
One of the things that I saw in your two chapters, going back to this issue that you put out actually in the initial abstracts and your orientation, this issue of universality versus cultural specificity and so forth, there were some differences there, and maybe we could turn to that, because when you begin to think about it the way you're just talking about it in terms of social expression, being understood, being able to function socially, these things happen inside a culture, they happen inside a history and circumstances, situations that we're in. And I'd be curious about, could we start out with this just issue of universality? You've got Darwin's Big Five. As you expand it out, you certainly can get to emotions that you can show just in the written record were never talked about in human culture, and then are talked about very commonly, usually metaphorically, depression, anxiety, for example, as opposed to these more basic things of sadness and fear. So could we talk just a little bit about this issue of universality to set up moving over into this issue of culture and context, so that the social nature of emotions can be explored and with that as a foundation? What is universal and what isn't?
Jack and I, off of the questions you asked, really had a long discussion on this, because obviously you don't really know the answer. We just are talking about it. And I think we think that the emotions are all universal, across the board, but how they're expressed, where it's okay to, there's a lot of cultures where it's not okay for women to show any anger. And if women show anger, it's interpreted as absolute rage, whereas with a man, it wouldn't be. So what's allowed to be expressed is very culture dependent. It's context. And even within a culture, it's, somebody, how they behave with their boss is one way, what kind of emotions they express and what they show on their face, and how they act when they go home is completely different. So even within one culture, there's the social, the class, social differences is very important. But it basically, all emotions have to be universal, and they have to be, at least antecedents have to be there in animals, at least higher primates.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense in terms of what you were saying, that the experience of emotion universal, kind of like what Ekman and Darwin argue, the expression is so different, and the frequency and the display rules. We tried to go a little bit farther just to see what that's like, and say that even less is universal. Maybe the universal point, the commonality between the way we see emotions is the survivalist function. So what could be common and universal about emotions, that it helps us as a species to survive, either individually or on the group level. However, it's interesting that emotions themselves, the experience of emotions themselves, can be very context dependent. And when you have so much variability in how people express emotions and even feel emotions, what is universal? And when you have as you could tell, I'm half Chinese and half American, and there's some emotions in my Chinese family that they experience completely differently. Sadness is a stomach ache. Anger is a headache. So I tend to believe that even less is universal than what was previously considered universal.
Do you really think giving it a different name is really different, makes it different? I mean, my experience cross-culturally with clients is that they may use a different verbal word, but the feeling is the same. And there's no way that, we study survivor guilt, and survivor guilt was not talked about in most of the history of psychology. But I think it's an experience universally, because we really prefer equity. Dogs prefer equity. We're not the only animal. So when things seem unequal, cheater detection is a module that people pick up really young, and cheater detection turned inward is really what survivor guilt's about. So even though this isn't discussed, or the words aren't there cross-culturally, something about that experience must be.
I agree. And that's why we could read a book that's been written centuries before of someone, the pain of loss or the joy of love. And, we could relate to that and say, oh, I know what that feels like. I'm not sure, though. I don't know the answer to that. The only way we know is through communication, and words are important. If I say I'm forlorn versus sad, are those different things? Is it the same thing? Is it what part is the same? And what do we consider universal? What does
Jack was trying to jump in if I was reading them right?
Yeah. I just wanted to say, part of our emphasis on universality just has to do with our evolutionary focus here. That emotions are evolved mechanisms. They're intended to help us solve problems and react successfully in sort of recurrent situations. So we have the evolved capacities, and I think a lot of these recurrent situations are simply cross-cultural. When you have human beings, child rearing is going to be important. Cooperation is going to be important. Mm-hmm. Everyone, regardless of culture, is going to encounter threats to their lives or their safety. There's going to be interpersonal conflict that might call forth aggression and anger. So we have these capacities, evolved, to respond to these situations. And I don't know that the situations have changed that much, in details, perhaps, but, I just see a lot of commonality. We all, surprise, we all encounter surprising things. So we've got an emotion and an expression for that. We all are going to encounter, smelly, disgusting things in our life. So the emotions evolve to deal with these common situations, and assuming that people are encountering similar situations, we ought to share a lot of the emotions. I mean, what elicits anger may differ from culture to culture. If I'm driving in the United States and someone tries to merge into traffic in front of me, if I give them the thumbs up symbol, they're going to smile and be kind of happy.
Mhm.
You know, if I'm in certain Middle Eastern or African countries, someone pulls in front of me, I give the thumbs up. I basically told them to,
Right.
basically equivalent to our middle finger gesture. All right. But I think if a person responds to our bird gesture or the thumbs up gesture in the same way, they've interpreted the situation similarly, and the emotion ought to be the same physiologically and so on. We use the same words for the emotions, even though they're elicited in different contexts, and so on. But there's commonality.
I would just add some nuance. I mean, I think those are really good points, and I think the way Kibbe and I think about it is maybe just a little bit nuanced from that perspective, though. I think the capacity, you make the point about the capacity, and I, we couldn't agree more. The capacity to detect non-consciously and consciously threat cues, the capacity to detect cues for opportunity, the capacity to do all sorts of things, right? These are very universal shared human capacities, are basic processes, fundamentally, right? Shared basic processes. The words we use to describe the arousal that we experience in what we call emotion, those words may differ, right, as a function of context and culture and many, many, many other variables, which we've talked about. The physiological experience, that there may be some shared universalities there, but I would argue that may not be quite as nuanced as the different affective state terms that we use in our language, right? That capacities at this level, really we're talking about capacities to approach, capacities to avoid or move away from, capacities to experience. But the particulars, the very kind of important particulars of what all that is and how we make sense of it and what we do with it, and how we express it, right? I mean, to your point, that thumbs up, is that emotion? Yeah. If by emotion we include expression of actions, which commonly, as we know, is part of the definition. So I think the input capacities are universal. The output language that's used and expression, I think that's more nuanced than purely universal. I also think our universality. Go ahead.
Yeah, we often develop new terms that describe the situation in which we feel what we might otherwise call anger. So, something along those lines. I think you're saying. I mean, how would you explain the definition of Schadenfreude or something like that? I mean, often definitions are it's that feeling when, and then you describe the situation.
Right. And so those people who have that learned history of understanding what those words mean and having it be reinforced by a sort of socio-verbal learning community, if you will, that word will make sense to them. But try explaining that word to a 7-year-old or a 6-year-old kid who hasn't quite learned. Maybe that's the wrong age, but a kid who hasn't quite learned, or someone of a different cultural background. It's tricky.
Yeah, and also.
Go ahead. The Schadenfreude example is an interesting one because when you fully explained it, I would think, most people can probably catch the feeling states that would be associated with it if they'd never thought of it as an emotion, as you might if you grew up in Germany. But if you take that to be what emotions is, that there's some sort of common basis on which, doesn't it mean that there are emotions that we don't even have that exist yet that will become emotions later on as we learn to focus on it? When I'm asking this of classes, I give the example of butterflies. Most people can relate to that metaphor, butterflies in your stomach, but we have no measures of it. We don't talk about, strong and weak butterflying. We don't talk about butterflying disorders, but you easily could. It wouldn't be hard at all. You can do it in a matter of minutes in a classroom setting.
But we talk about anxiety. Butterflies in the stomach is a more lyrical way to talk about anxiety. Maybe
no. I think if you do that, Lynn, then you really have to give me the standards you're using when you say it's all of the emotions are shared. Now it sounds like you have a pre-existing categorization that's shared. And if that's true, then the say Schadenfreude is not really a distinct emotion. It's really something else. And are you going to take them all down to the big five? What is the list?
Yeah, I think that's interesting too, because I think in emotion science, they're seeing it as more of a dimensional than the categorical. Because if you think about the context, about how the context would shape emotion, how we express it, Schadenfreude is just pleasure, it's just happiness. But it has a contextual part of being happy because of someone else's pain, which can confer benefit to you and your family or whoever you want to survive. So I think it's interesting to think about what part of that is the universal and what would actually be adapted to be a very specific kind of pleasure, experience a specific kind of context where that would be adaptive.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's that, yeah, happy is universal, but happy in different situations. You could find a use for new words to describe happiness in various contexts. It's true.
Yeah, and then is it a different kind of happiness? Is Schadenfreude feel different than like me getting a birthday present? I think that's the experience there. I don't know what the defining factor of experience versus communication and what is universal versus contextual.
Well, then what are the standards? Could we, and then I kind of got a little too excited there, but what are the standards that we would use if you were to say, for example, well, the real emotion is happy, even if we're happy over someone else's sadness? If, for example, you said physiological, but then we go look and let's say your brain lights up differently. It easily could. So what are the standards for the categories and distinctions when we say the emotions, and we mean not just everything without a label, but we actually mean categories or something that we could use scientifically or clinically? Do you have ones that you think are particularly important that would distinguish these things into relatively distinct dimensions, chunks? It doesn't have to be categorical, it could be dimensional. Right.
I think we talked about, just playing with the perspective of the context first, the thinking about the contextualism, about what works in a given context, what helps someone survive in a given context. If you think about the context, threat, for example, is one category of context that leads to, different kinds of emotions, but different action tendencies in order to fulfill, overcoming that threat. So if we think about it that way, we think, what about function? What if function was the way we could categorize emotions?
Lynn, Jack, what are the standards? How do we know what the categories are or the dimensions?
We haven't done that. We haven't thought that way.
I'm not sure. I mean,
thought that way. We haven't tried to. Again, we thought more of a broader package and the interpersonal nature of emotions. I don't think we have tried to. I think you're asking, how do we think in terms of something like the way Ekman delineated these are the basic emotions? Is that what you're, and then everything else he says is a complex or, includes more than one emotion. Is that what you're wondering? I wasn't sure what you were asking. Jack?
Well, I'm trying, when you say all emotions are universal, and I was using butterflying and you said, no, but that's just anxiety. So it sounds like there is a kind of a categorical set or not. And I'm just trying to get what is universal. And if it is a categorical set or a set of dimensions, what are their defining features? Where does anxiety end and happiness begin, or butterflying or Schadenfreude or whatever? These different kinds of distinctions that are there. We're about to go into the issue of culture. I was saying we wanted to use this to get there. And that's why I'm pushing a little bit on this, because when we get to culture, we'll need something more than examples. We need how to think through how culture penetrates this phenomena and can organize it. Are there categories? I mean, are Darwin's big five the categories, or it wouldn't have to be Ekman's; it could be anything. I'm asking.
That was a start. You have to start somewhere, and I suppose he started with Darwin's observations. I don't know what things would have looked like if you had begun with some kind of cultural, extreme cultural relativism. I mean, how do you, starting from that end of things, emotions vary widely. We're almost alien to each other. That language determines even perception. This sort of thing. Start with those assumptions. I don't know. How would you start narrowing things down? You don't want to say that every person in every different context has a different emotion, or maybe you would. But how are you going to provide some unity to the field if everything is simply almost existentially, unique in some way? I don't know. I don't. Ekman started with his, let's focus on, cross-cultural emotions that all have, recognizable facial expressions. So he started. You do have to start somewhere. I don't know if that was the proper place to start or not, but. So I don't have any other alternative.
I don't know if having a word for something, I don't know if having a word is the way to think about it, actually, or will give us any information, because butterflies in the stomach is a way of talking about anxiety as I interpret it. When I have butterflies in my stomach, I certainly know what it feels like. It's on the edge of anxiety usually. And if you think about guilt, well, it's a good idea if you're looking for something on guilt to look up regret or look up remorse. There's a bunch of different words that sort of cover that terrain, sort of like butterflies in the stomach and anxiety. So I'm not sure how to conceptualize what you're asking, actually. I'm not quite sure, other than to say, Ekman's categories, what's red from the face is that didn't cover enough. Other than to say that there's a lot more than those 6 basic emotions. I'm not sure how to answer that or even how to think about it.
So let me just jump in and try to just offer maybe a way to think about it. I mean, to me, the quest, and Jack, this is to your point, the quest scientifically to identify potential universal emotions makes sense from a scientific. In the context of conducting science, that pursuit makes a lot of sense, right? And in the context of trying to help people, that pursuit makes a lot of sense too, right? The more efficient we could be with understanding what each other is expressing, the better, for lots of reasons, scientifically and in terms of more applied ways of thinking. But I think that makes me take a step back and think about the question in maybe even a different way, Steve. I think I would answer the question as that you posed as it depends really on what the function is of the framework. So what is the purpose of outlining the parameters on the terms or the words that are used? What is the context for that function? I think that's really important because I can certainly in therapy, as I do therapy, I'm going to use in that context words that I think will likely resonate and therefore give purpose and meaning and value and clarity, and help that individual change longstanding patterns of ways of thinking, relating, feeling, et cetera, et cetera. But that's very different than the science I might do the next hour. The science I do the next hour, I might be using a dimensional framework that allows me to try to predict and control certain variables in a very kind of particular context. So I guess the point I'm making is maybe simple. It's that the parameters of how we define emotion are a function of the context in which we do the defining.
Yeah, and to Lynn's point too, that these packages, that is a nice metaphor for it, because it isn't one thing or another. It isn't, if you look at Ekman's work, you think an emotion is just the face. Other work you see that's just the neurological responses or the thoughts for other people, but it really is the package. And we're trying to think about the function of that package in terms of a person's survival. That's one way to see of something universal, that we all have to survive. And in some cases, we feel if there's a threat to our lives and we need to run away, we feel fear and communicate that. And the package happens about fear. And across time and context, those different, that could take different permutations.
Well, the answer that you gave there, Zach, is an interesting one because, in a way, you took the contextual nature of emotion and then you applied it to the contextual nature of even analyzing emotion.
Right.
As if, and in some ways, you could even think of it this way: that the scientific culture, the clinical culture, you could, and so it's kind of consistent a way to approach it. But let me move over to that issue of culture. How do your different perspectives of the two teams land when you consider the issue of culture? And is it just a matter of expression? Is it more than that? What is the importance of culture in this whole topical area of emotion and empathy?
Well, I think we wrote about this pretty clearly, but what emotions are sort of more acceptable or less acceptable does seem to depend on what's functional in the given setting. Like we talked about how never an anger in Alaskan Native Americans in a way, because they can't disperse. If there's a real debate, if there's a fight, people can't just disperse, they'll die, essentially. So there are a lot more rules against anger, and I think, in fact, people therefore probably experience less anger. It's so frowned upon. So culture can actually, just in the collectivism, individualism sort of distinction that we looked at just as an example of culture, it seems that what emotions are more promoted or less promoted may be based on the culture, which may be based on the needs due to the material conditions, basically. In the end, it comes down to the material conditions.
Conditions in terms of what's needed to survive?
Yeah, I mean, like high pathogen load, or, you're living in horrifically constant blizzard conditions. Those are like empirical conditions, material conditions, environmental, basic.
Yes.
Yeah, how to survive in the landscape.
Right, and I think that's an interesting point of how to survive, and different cultures with different geographical locations and conditions have to determine what over time determine what is needed to survive. So if you need cohesion, expressing anger may not be adaptive, because that leads to separation. So I think that's a really interesting point of focusing on that, the ultimate goal of survival.
Right. I mean, I think that does explain a lot of, I can't give real examples. We could all brainstorm, but I think it sort of is the bottom line explanation for why we have cross-cultural differences in the expression, what's allowed, emotional tendencies, what's promoted, and what's sort of not as acceptable.
Right, and as Jack said earlier, the inputs in may be very, that elicit what we call emotion might be very consistent across culture, across time. That we might come up with, unique terms to define the situations, but ultimately, survival threat cues are survival threat cues are survival threat cues, and cues that signal opportunity for mating or reproduction, et cetera. Those are those cues. But I think what you just said is right on, and from the way we think about it, Lynn, that even though the inputs may be universal in eliciting these kind of cascading systems that really are networked together in our body, the output in how we think, express, communicate, relate, move toward or move away from, and all of our behavioral response tendencies, those things are moderated by cultural factors and many. So I think the cultural sort of lens is really the way to filter the universal inputs that we see cross-culturally.
Jack and I talking about, we were, inspired by Steve's questions. So we had this long discussion like, well, why is it important to see? Why do we think it's important to think about the universality of emotions? And what are we talking about? Why does it matter? Why is thinking about cross-culture matter? And I think we decided that increasingly we are really dealing with a global world, a global economy, maybe increasingly important. There's been so much focus on differences, cross-cultural differences. And sometimes it leads to not great, relationships. Maybe it is really important, increasingly important, that we do understand the universality of our sort of makeup and our, propensity to adapt to local conditions. So maybe having a universality perspective may actually come to be important. That's sort of political.
Yeah, that wouldn't be a scientific benefit, but certainly a benefit to actually cooperating with other people. It is true that in extreme relativism, just it makes people seem alien, and we know that empathy is fostered by similarity. So why, if we can emphasize, here's how we're alike, to some degree, that could certainly help human relationships across cultures potentially.
I agree. I just would make the point, Kibbe, I'll be brief, that maybe it's a false dichotomy. Maybe what we're playing with here is a false dichotomy between universality and relativism. And maybe some things are more shared and universal, and some things really are relative. And maybe as we think about how to synthesize those two viewpoints as it relates to emotion, maybe that would, to your point, I love this point. I don't think it's just political. I think it's political, and it's also important in lots of other areas. But maybe thinking about the resolution between this apparent dichotomy, maybe looking for a synthesis could actually do something to help us relate better in our increasingly globalized world, so that we can understand each other. Not because we assume universality is there at every level, but because we know maybe some things are universal and some are not.
Yeah, exactly. So we would want to emphasize the it's sort of the commonalities that underlie the differences, although the differences actually relate to the commonalities. We have to explain, this shared value is expressed in different ways. That's sort of synthesis, I suppose.
You're trying to get in.
Yeah, I know. I'm really excited because Zach and I were talking recently about what empathy and globalization, and how we have so much. This is the first time in history we have so much contact with so many different cultures, that this question about needing that a larger if you think about it as a language, we need a larger vocabulary of understanding other people's emotional expressions. Either that or we find a common language to express emotion. We all have text messages, and we around the world, an emoji, a smiley emoji is the same thing. And so that makes all of these questions even more relevant now, where how do we understand an emotional expression for someone across the globe? Do we develop our own, a common language, a universal language for that? Do we have something universal, but also adaptations like a dialect? It's a very interesting question.
One of the things I was interested in actually is in the chapter that Lynn and Jack wrote, of talking about even things like the 5-HTT transporter gene across cultures. This issue of universality, you were talking about universality of input, but some people would interpret that to mean physiological input. But here's this very basic physiological difference that has very clear differences in terms of how it's expressed, and also in the number of folks who have the particular too short alleles, for example, in Asia versus the rest of the world. And so it suggests that we really are going to have to, as a scientific matter, look at this in a much more systemic, kind of complex network way, rather than a simple, that's universal, that isn't. It's a complex thing, and the features of it are going to function differently in different contexts.
We kind of think of that as like we talk about, how do we think about this? Like a gene is like, everybody's got genes, and we all have kind of some similar genes, but there's variations, there's different alleles, and having variation, we don't have life without variation. If we have, that's what's happening with our agriculture. It's all one seed, Monsanto, thank you. If there's some of a epidemic of some fungus that kills all that seed, then we're not going to have any wheat. And personality and emotionality is all, evolution is based on units on which there's variation. If there's no variation, there's no nothing. can't be of life. So Jack was thinking about it in terms of the body. You know, if you have a cell, they're all the same, you're going to have cancer. We have to have variation within our cellular structures in the body, even within different units in the body. So that's really important. That's what I think, having that variation and having cultural affect that variation is really fascinating.
The clock tells us we have just a few minutes, and I don't want to let us go without turning the implications of all of what we've been talking about and of this domain to the practical issue of behavior change and psychotherapy. What would you want an applied person who is reading these chapters and perhaps watching this discussion to take away as they go into their next session, for example, if they're a psychotherapist with somebody, in terms of how they think about emotion and empathy? Is there something that you could distill down the essence of this to some places where the rubber really meets the road, and professionals who are having to deal with emotionality and emotional disorders and emotional expression, emotional regulation, as the 9-to-5 world they live in? What is the takeaway? Are there a couple things that you think are really important that we should be able to say as an expression of this, or extension of it?
I would say simply that the context, I would say to that person, the context of understanding emotion is more important than being right about what that emotion is.
Could you explain what you mean, Zach?
Well, just that in an applied context, that if I'm a clinician and I'm helping someone, or if I'm a supervisor and I'm training someone to become effective as a clinician, one thing I think I would want to get out of our chapter is that what's important is not to assume you are right about the emotional expression, or train or teach or help your patients believe that they are right, or that they have the truth of what someone is experiencing or expressing, but instead to really be thinking about emotional empathy and the understanding of other human beings from a more pragmatic, contextualistic way of thinking. So to think about what works rather than what is, from their perspective, true or right.
Yeah, I go along with that. And I think that what I use with patients related to this is the idea that context matters. And I think that's one of the major things I teach patients. You know, a patient will come in who's very, sort of depressed, and they'll say, that's the way I am. And I think I teach patients to go about, well, when did your mood drop? And who were you talking to? And it was always in a specific context, that their emotions, in other words, their emotions that context is relevant. They got depressed when someone put them down, so they started feeling bad. So their emotion was related to that context. Then they interpret, well, that's the way I am, and feel kind of hopeless. But when they begin to be able to link their feelings to particular contexts, that really makes a difference. So I was thinking, I use words, certainly, but I think teaching an idea of context and emotions to patients is something I really do make use of. It may be one of the most important things I do. So that's what I take away.
Yeah, and as a trained clinician, I found it's really helpful to think about and teach patients that their emotions make sense in context. It takes a lot of the shame and the blame and the stigma of I'm feeling sad, and just to say, well, let's look at all the contextual factors and what's going on in your life and what's going on now right here in this session. It makes sense what you're feeling. And so then they could really tap into that emotion and work with it instead of trying to push it away or feel ashamed about it. So I think the validating someone's emotion in context is something that I've learned to be, it's really, really useful.
Yeah. I'll just say one last thing that occurred that I want to make sure is added is that if what we're all sort of converging on as an agreement is that emotions, as we define them for applied purposes, are critically important, that they're the driver of so much of what we do, then what I would say, Steve, to your question is that emotions really, to help a patient or a client understand their emotions is to help them gain insight, which is equal really in my thinking, from a behavioral perspective, to the ability to predict and respond effectively to these contextual kind of circumstances that have been learned and associated with problem behaviors. So essentially, emotion gets connected to insight, which gets connected to life change.
So I'm hearing these issues of awareness, attention, context sensitivity, understanding are kind of critical to change. What about you were talking about a variation as so critical, Lynn. What about just the issue of emotional flexibility? Is part of our job as change agents to actually help people open the door to experience of emotion or expression of emotion that is appropriate in some context that might have been suppressed or ignored or unseen or whatever? What about the issue of variation and flexibility?
Is that to everyone, or is that to?
Yeah, I'm just asking because it seems as though sometimes, especially in psychotherapy, some of the more evocative wings, if you look at the motion-focused therapy people, a Sue Johnson or Les Greenberg, or, that they would really be looking for and trying to push people into emotional territory that perhaps the person had not explored, perhaps due to these kinds of things like we just don't do anger up here in this cold part of the world. That may come all the way down to somebody's particular family history where, I've actually had clients tell me, I don't do anger. And I ask them, and of course they have a family of origin history where that was just prohibited and very, very strongly punished. And then sometimes, you can see people are angry and they'll, with their veins sticking out of their neck, saying, no, I'm not angry. And then it makes it hard for them to be able to understand their motivation and why things play out in that way. So I'm just raising a more general issue that as an additional one to the list that you've made, which I think is a very good one about this issue of openness and flexibility.
I think if the response repertoire, if the sort of range of responses that happen with regard to any particular emotional state, if that response repertoire is so narrow or non-existent, and that's causing some sort of problem that's discernible, then I think that's something to put on the table. But I don't think it's our job to just assume that is a problem. I think that that would be a problem to do that, to assume that. I think it's a dialogue with the client or the patient to make sense of their learning history, their values, their goals, where they need to go, and what's getting in the way. And if a narrow response repertoire as it relates to emotion is one of those factors, even if they're not open to that, but they are willing to consider that, I think that's worth exploring at a pace that makes sense for that client or patient. Right,
and thinking about the flexibility about what works in context, what actually fulfills the client's goals or live in line with their values, given the situations they're in. Before, in other contexts and other times, not expressing anger was really adaptive and fulfilled certain goals. And that might not be the case in their present life, and that's what their problem is. So I guess figuring out what works in context and helping patients get there.
Lynn or Jack, you want to jump in on this final topic?
Well, yeah, I'm not a therapist and never trained as a therapist, and I've never been in therapy, so I got nothing.
That's everything.
And Lynn, a final word?
No, I think it's a great discussion. And I was just thinking, this is so interesting. I've never done anything like it. If we could track all of our emotions uniquely, each of us, that we have experienced in the last hour and a half, it would be really interesting. And how much we are driven by emotions, and they are not conscious and they are not labeled, but they sure are they're sure relevant. It would be a really interesting. I don't know if anyone else thought of that, but
yeah, if hungry is emotion, that's definitely something that I've been feeling the past hour. So,
right, isn't that something to think about? Yeah.
Well, it would be an interesting project, and perhaps those who are watching have also been feeling some emotions watching, and one that I'm feeling right now is appreciation. I think it's been a fascinating conversation, and it really does, I think, show the importance of having a dialogue across these great traditions of evolution science and this contextual functional behavioral science. And it makes me feel hopeful for the world to just watch the conversation that we've been having, because I think we're doing something that could be helpful to other people. And with that, I'd just like to thank you each for your participation, and to those of you who are watching, thank you for watching, and I hope you find the volume useful.